On August 23, 2005, two European students, Anya Weber and Oskar Lindgren, vanished into the humid night of New Orleans. For 7 years, their case was a cold, heartbreaking mystery, swallowed by the chaos of Hurricane Katrina and the silence of a broken city. Their families were left with nothing but ghosts and unanswered questions. The official story was that they were victims of the storm. But that was a lie. The truth was far more sinister, and it was hiding in plain sight, inside a decommissioned police car destined for the scrap heap. It was a discovery that would not only solve a disappearance, but expose a rot at the very heart of the city's law enforcement. How could a conspiracy so dark remain buried for so long, protected by the very people sworn to serve and protect? Before we reveal how a simple discovery inside a glove compartment unraveled a corrupt police ring, comment below and let us know where you're watching from, and be sure to subscribe to the channel. Trust me, you won't want to miss the chain of events this single finding set in motion. The story of Anya and Oskar is more than just a missing persons case. It's a testament to how truth, no matter how deeply buried, can claw its way to the surface. Their journey for adventure ended in tragedy, but their story would ultimately bring down a powerful and dangerous network that believed it was untouchable. The evidence had been waiting for 7 years, silent and patient, for someone to finally look in the right place. Anya Weber, 22, from Switzerland, was the meticulous planner, the one who documented their journey with an artist's eye. Her digital camera was her constant companion. Oskar Lindgren, 24, from Sweden, was the charismatic adventurer, always pushing them to experience the authentic heart of America. They were both brilliant architecture students, deeply in love, on the final leg of a 3-month road trip they'd chronicled on their blog, Blueprint for Adventure. Their posts were filled with the wide-eyed optimism of youth, a genuine awe for the landscapes and people they encountered. They weren't reckless. They were just naive, believing in the inherent goodness of strangers. New Orleans was meant to be their grand finale, a soulful celebration before returning home to start their careers and their life together. They arrived in a city that was a powder keg of contradictions. August 2005 in New Orleans was a pressure cooker of heat, music, and deep-seated tension. The French Quarter pulsed with life, a tourist mecca of jazz clubs, Creole cuisine, and carefree celebration. But just beyond the wrought iron balconies lay a different reality, a city struggling with poverty, rampant crime, and a police department infamous for its corruption. This was the eve of Hurricane Katrina, a time of anxious energy hanging in the air. For Anya and Oskar, the city's labyrinthine streets were enchanting, not dangerous. They saw the soul, not the peril. They were outsiders, completely unaware of the unwritten rules that govern survival in a city where the line between hospitality and hostility was perilously thin. Their last day of normalcy was captured forever on their blog, a joyful photo of them in Jackson Square, smiling, with the St. Louis Cathedral rising behind them. The post was titled, "Hello, Big Easy, the Grand Finale." They checked into a modest guest house in the Faubourg Marigny, a neighborhood known for its colorful Creole cottages and proximity to the French Quarter's energy. They were excited, energized by the city's vibrant atmosphere. That evening, they left their rental car behind and walked towards the neon glow of Bourbon Street, ready to immerse themselves in the music and nightlife they had read so much about. It was the last time anyone from their world would know their whereabouts. They walked into the heart of the city, completely unaware that they were walking into a trap. The last confirmed sighting of Anya and Oskar came from a vendor at a late-night beignet stand near the river. He recalled the young, happy couple engaged in a friendly conversation with two men in New Orleans Police Department uniforms. The vendor later told investigators, what little investigation there was, that the officers appeared to be offering the tourists a safe, private tour of the real New Orleans, away from the typical tourist spots. Anya and Oskar, trusting of authority and eager for an authentic experience, seemingly accepted. When their daily email to their frantic parents in Europe never arrived the next day, concern turned to panic. But their personal crisis was about to be completely erased by a citywide catastrophe. Less than a week later, Hurricane Katrina made landfall, severing all communication and plunging New Orleans into a state of apocalyptic chaos. In the immediate aftermath of Hurricane Katrina, the disappearance of Anya and Oscar was not a priority. It was barely a statistic. As the levees broke and floodwaters consumed New Orleans, the city descended into a primal struggle for survival. The Weber and Lindgren families, watching the apocalyptic images from thousands of miles away in Europe, felt a unique and isolating horror. Their personal tragedy was completely eclipsed by a public catastrophe. Calls to the Swiss and Swedish embassies went unanswered. Emails vanished into dead servers. The New Orleans Police Department, fractured and fighting for its own existence, had no resources, no time, and no records to spare for two missing tourists. Anya and Oscar had vanished just before the world turned upside down, and in the chaos that followed, it was as if they had been erased from existence itself. Months later, as the waters receded and a semblance of order was restored, the NOPD finally addressed the case. The official conclusion was as simple as it was convenient. Anya and Oscar were tragic victims of the storm. They were added to the long, anonymous list of the dead and missing. This theory provided a neat, if heartbreaking, resolution for the authorities. It closed the file. For the families, however, it was an unbearable fiction. They knew their children. Anya was too careful. Oscar too resourceful. They wouldn't have been caught so easily. The beignet vendor's crucial testimony about the two police officers, given in a fleeting moment of pre-storm normalcy, was never properly recorded, lost in the bureaucratic collapse. The official story was a tidy explanation that required no further investigation, leaving the families with a hollow certainty that the truth was something else entirely. Refusing to accept the city's verdict, Anya's father, a retired civil servant named Klaus Weber, and Oscar's mother, Lena Lindgren, made the difficult journey to New Orleans in early 2006. They stepped into a landscape of ruin that mirrored their own internal devastation. They walked the debris-strewn streets of the French Quarter, clutching photos of their smiling children, showing them to strangers whose own eyes were filled with loss. They navigated a city of FEMA trailers, military patrols, and a traumatized populace. The guest house where the couple had stayed was heavily damaged, its records destroyed. The police officials they met with were dismissive, exhausted, and offered only condolences for their loss in the hurricane. The trip yielded nothing but a deeper sense of helplessness, a confirmation that they were utterly alone in their search for answers. The financial and emotional cost of this private war for truth was staggering. Over the next few years, Klaus Weber systematically liquidated his life savings, pouring over $50,000 into the pockets of private investigators. These investigators, hired to do the job the police wouldn't, repeatedly hit the same brick walls. Records were gone, witnesses had scattered across the country, and the NOPD was a fortress of indifference. Each report came back the same: no new leads, no credible sightings, no evidence. The hope that fueled Klaus's methodical search began to curdle into a quiet, simmering rage. He was paying for answers in a city that seemed determined to keep its secrets, a city that had swallowed his daughter, and now seemed to be draining the very life from him as well. For Lena Lindgren, the strain was unbearable. The torment of ambiguous loss, the psychological torture of not knowing if her son was dead or alive, eroded her spirit. She suffered a severe nervous breakdown in 2008, unable to reconcile the vibrant memory of her adventurous son with the silent void he had left behind. Birthdays, holidays, and the changing of seasons became brutal markers of time passing without him. The families were trapped in a state of suspended grief, unable to mourn properly because a sliver of hope, however faint and painful, refused to die. They were living ghosts in their own lives, their existence defined by an absence, a question mark that hung over every waking moment. The silence from New Orleans was not peaceful. It was a deafening roar of uncertainty that never ceased. This prolonged agony was punctuated by moments of cruel, manufactured hope. A few years into the investigation, a series of false leads emerged, each one a fresh stab to the heart. There were supposed sightings of a couple matching their description in a refugee camp in Houston, a lead that sent Klaus on a frantic, fruitless trip to Texas. Later, a grotesque ransom email arrived, demanding money for their safe return. The families, clinging to any possibility, engaged with the sender, only for police to trace it to an internet cafe in Nigeria, a common, heartless scam preying on the desperate. Each dead end was more than a disappointment. It was a re-traumatization, a reminder of their powerlessness. It felt as though the world was not just indifferent to their pain, but actively conspiring to deepen it. By 2012, 7 years after they vanished, the case of Anya Weber and Oskar Lindgren was officially colder than ice. The file sat in a dusty archive box at NOPD headquarters, a relic of a pre-Katrina world. The media had long since moved on to new tragedies. The Swiss and Swedish governments had exhausted their diplomatic inquiries, receiving only polite, bureaucratic shrugs in return. For the world, Anya and Oskar were a forgotten footnote in the story of a great American disaster. But for their families, time had not healed the wound. It had only deepened it. They were left with a quiet, private vigil, a promise to never stop looking, even as they knew, deep down, that they were searching for ghosts. The truth they believed had been washed away by the storm. They had no idea it was simply waiting, hidden in a metal box for a chance to be found. The break in the case came not from a detective's hunch or a deathbed confession, but from the screech of metal in a place where forgotten things go to die. In October 2012, at a sprawling scrapyard in Chalmette, just east of New Orleans, a mechanic named James was doing his job. His task was mundane: strip any valuable parts from a line of decommissioned NOPD Ford Crown Victorias before they were fed to the crusher. These cars were ghosts of the city's past, bearing the silent scars of 1,000 call-outs. James worked methodically, his hands greasy, his mind on quitting time. He had no idea he was about to pry open a 7-year-old wound, exposing a rot that had festered just beneath the city's surface, hidden inside the very vehicle meant to represent law and order. As he worked on the dashboard of one particularly battered Crown Victoria, his crowbar popped the glove compartment panel clean off its hinges. It was a routine move, but what lay behind it was not. Instead of insulation and wiring, he saw a crudely fashioned hollow space, a secret compartment carved into the car's interior. James, a lifelong resident of the parish, had heard all the stories about the NOPD. His curiosity was immediately tinged with a deep-seated suspicion. This wasn't a standard modification. This was a hiding place. He paused, the sounds of the scrapyard fading into the background. He felt a cold knot tighten in his stomach. Whatever was in there, it was not meant to be found. He reached into the dusty void, his fingers brushing against something smooth and cool. What he pulled out was a large, sealed plastic bag, coated in a fine layer of grime. Through the translucent plastic, he could make out the shapes of its contents. With trembling hands, he tore it open. Inside were 2 European passports, one Swiss, one Swedish. A digital camera, its lens shattered and its body cracked, and a small, weathered notebook, its pages warped by years of humidity. He opened the first passport and saw the smiling face of a young woman named Anya Weber. In the second, a young man named Oskar Lindgren. The names meant nothing to him, but the implications were immediate and terrifying. These items, belonging to foreign tourists, had been deliberately concealed inside a police car. This wasn't lost property. This was buried evidence. James stood frozen for a moment, the weight of his discovery pressing down on him. His first instinct was not to call 911. He knew, with the bone-deep certainty of someone who understood how New Orleans worked, that turning this over to the NOPD would be like throwing it back into the hole he'd just found it in. It would vanish, and he might vanish with it. He thought of his family, of the quiet life he had built. Getting involved was a risk he couldn't afford. But the faces in the passports, so young, so full of life, haunted him. Leaving them to be crushed with the car felt like a second murder. He made a decision that would defy a lifetime of looking the other way. He carefully placed the bag in his toolbox, hid it under a pile of rags, and finished his shift as if nothing had happened. That night, sleep offered no escape. The faces from the passports stared back at him in the darkness. He knew he couldn't go to the police, but he couldn't do nothing. He remembered a series of articles he'd read in Asterisk, the Times-Picayune, written by an investigative reporter named Sarah Jenkins. She had a reputation for being relentless, for taking on the city's most powerful and corrupt figures without blinking. She was, he reasoned, his only safe option. The next morning, using a payphone miles from his home, he made an anonymous call to the newspaper's tip line. His message was brief and cryptic. "I found something in an old cop car. Something they didn't want anyone to see. It's about 2 tourists who went missing before the storm." He hung up before they could ask any questions, his heart pounding in his chest. Sarah Jenkins recognized the scent of a real story. Anonymous tips were common, but this one had the chilling ring of authenticity. She agreed to a discreet meeting in a nondescript coffee shop in the Garden District, far from the prying eyes of the French Quarter. James arrived looking pale and nervous, clutching a worn gym bag. Without saying much, he slid the plastic bag across the table. As Sarah carefully examined the passports, the shattered camera, and the small notebook, she felt a jolt of adrenaline. The names Anya Weber and Oskar Lindgren finally clicked into place, the European students who were officially listed as victims of Hurricane Katrina. This discovery didn't just challenge that narrative, it obliterated it. She looked at the terrified mechanic and made a promise to protect his identity, knowing she was now the custodian of a secret that could get them both killed. Back at the newspaper's office, the investigation began in secret. The first priority was the camera. Sarah handed it over to a digital forensics expert who began the painstaking work of trying to recover data from the damaged memory card. While he worked, Sarah focused on the notebook. It was not a diary. Its pages were filled with columns of dates from 2004 and 2005, followed by sets of initials and various cash amounts. It was a ledger, a meticulous record of illicit transactions. One set of initials appeared more frequently than any other, FR. This wasn't the journal of a tourist. It was the account book of a criminal. The truth of what happened to Anya and Oskar was no longer a question of fate or natural disaster. It was a story of a calculated crime, and the first thread of the conspiracy was now firmly in Sarah's hands. The forensic expert worked for 3 sleepless days, his efforts a delicate dance between technology and hope. Finally, he called Sarah. He had recovered a partial sequence of images from the camera's corrupted memory card. The first few photos were exactly what one would expect. Joyful, blurry shots of Bourbon Street at night, the neon lights reflecting in Anya's excited eyes. But then the sequence took a chilling turn. The next images were taken from inside a moving car. Anya and Oskar were in the back seat, their initial smiles slowly tightening into expressions of confusion, then dawning fear. The final recoverable photo was a chaotic, tilted shot of the car's interior. But in the side window a reflection was captured with haunting clarity. The sharp, angular face of a man in the driver's seat, his eyes cold and unsmiling. It was the face of their guide, their captor, and their executioner. Armed with this ghostly image, Sarah Jenkins began her own methodical hunt. She returned to the ledger, focusing on the most frequent initials, FR. Her contacts at the city archives, working off the books, began pulling NOPD personnel files from 2005. The process was slow and fraught with dead ends. But after a week of cross-referencing, she found him. Detective Frank Russo. The man in the archive photo was older, but the hard eyes and grim set of his jaw were unmistakable. He was a perfect match for the face in the reflection. Russo's file was a monument to institutional failure, riddled with citizen complaints of excessive force, intimidation, and theft, all of which were dismissed. He had taken an, quote, early retirement for undisclosed reasons just months after Katrina, vanishing from the force with a full pension. The pieces were no longer just scattered. They were beginning to form a terrifying picture. The ledger now became the key to unlocking the entire conspiracy. With Frank Russo identified, Sarah and her small, trusted team worked in secret, cross-referencing the other initials against his known associates and the members of his former unit. A pattern quickly emerged. The initials belonged to a tight-knit group of plainclothes officers who worked the French Quarter Beat, a crew known unofficially within the department as the Gators. They were Russo's men. Sarah then matched the dates in the ledger to old, unsolved crime reports from that era. The correlations were staggering. A date next to a $2,000 entry corresponded with the night a wealthy Brazilian tourist was robbed at gunpoint, a case that went cold instantly. Another matched the disappearance of a young backpacker from Germany. The notebook wasn't just a record of bribes. It was a balance sheet for a campaign of terror waged against the city's most vulnerable visitors. The horrifying truth of their operation came into focus. Frank Russo and his crew had perfected a predatory system. They didn't target locals who might have connections. They targeted tourists, people who were transient, trusting, and often carrying large amounts of cash. Using the authority of their badges, they offered a, quote, private tour or a safe escort back to their hotel. Once the victims were isolated in their unmarked vehicle, the friendly facade would drop. They would drive them to a secluded spot, rob them of their money, cameras, and jewelry, and then, to ensure there were no witnesses, they would eliminate them. Anya and Oscar, with their optimistic blog and trusting nature, were tragically ideal targets. They weren't victims of a random act of violence. They were the victims of a calculated and brutally efficient criminal enterprise operating from inside the New Orleans Police Department. Sarah began a deep dive into the city's cold case files, searching for other victims who fit the profile. The search was grim and heartbreaking. She found at least 3 other missing persons cases from 2004 and 2005 that bore the chilling hallmarks of Russo's crew. A young Canadian couple on their honeymoon, last seen in the French Quarter. An Australian student who had vanished after a night out. In every case, the NOPD investigation was cursory at best. The official narrative was always a variation on the same theme. They likely fell victim to street crime, or perhaps they simply decided to leave the city without telling anyone. These explanations, once plausible, now seemed like a deliberate and systemic cover-up. These weren't cold cases. They were buried murders, hidden by the chaos of the city and the indifference of the very department that committed them. As Sarah prepared to connect the final dots, a wall of silence descended. The source she had cultivated inside the NOPD for years suddenly stopped returning her calls. When she requested access to the storage logs for decommissioned police vehicles, she was told the records from that period had been irretrievably lost in the flooding after Katrina, a convenient, all-purpose excuse. Then came the more direct warning. A retired officer she sometimes spoke to for background information met her for coffee, and, without making eye contact, told her she was wading into deep water, and that, quote, some things from before the storm are best left buried. The message was clear. Russo wasn't just a ghost of the past. He still had allies, people in positions of power who were willing to protect him and the department's dark secrets. The conspiracy was not dead, it was dormant. The final, crucial piece of the puzzle came from the one person completely outside the system, James, the mechanic. Convinced he was the only one she could trust, Sarah arranged one last clandestine meeting. She showed him the photograph of Frank Russo from the NOPD archives. James's face went pale. He recognized the man, not from the news but from his life. He told Sarah that years ago, before the scrapyard was sold to its current owners, a man who looked exactly like Russo used to come by every few months. He would speak quietly with the old foreman and walk through the rows of decommissioned NOPD vehicles, lingering near the very section where the Crown Victoria had sat for years. Russo hadn't just forgotten about the car, he had been checking on it, ensuring his secrets remained safe. This was the direct link Sarah needed, proof that Russo was knowingly tied to that specific vehicle, the tomb of his crimes. With the evidence now irrefutable and James's testimony providing the direct link, Sarah Jenkins knew she couldn't wait. The risk of the story being suppressed or of witnesses disappearing was too great. On a Sunday morning in late October 2012, the Times-Picayune published her explosive front-page exposé under the headline, "The Ghosts of Katrina, Hidden Passports Expose NOPD Murder Ring." The article laid out the entire 7-year timeline, complete with the recovered photos of Anja and Oscar, the haunting reflection of Frank Russo, and excerpts from the damning ledger. The city awoke to a scandal that cut deeper than any floodwater. It wasn't just a story about 2 murdered tourists. It was a story about a city's soul, about a police force that had not just failed its citizens, but had actively preyed upon its visitors. The public outcry was a tidal wave of fury and grief. The story detonated on a national level within hours. News networks picked it up, broadcasting the smiling faces of the young European couple alongside the grim mugshot of the former detective. The Swiss and Swedish governments, which had for years been met with bureaucratic indifference, now had the political leverage they needed. Citing the article, their embassies issued formal diplomatic protests, demanding immediate and transparent action from the U.S. State Department. The pressure on New Orleans became unbearable. Bowing to the inevitable, the local U.S. Attorney's Office announced that the NOPD would be recused from the case entirely. Citing a profound conflict of interest and a complete breakdown of public trust, they formally requested that the FBI take over the investigation. Federal agents were on planes to New Orleans by nightfall, a clear signal that the era of local protection and buried secrets was officially over. The FBI's first priority was to secure their most important asset, the scrapyard mechanic. James and his family were taken from their home in the middle of the night and placed into the Federal Witness Protection Program, their identities and past lives erased for their safety. In a secure debriefing room hundreds of miles away, James finally told his full story without fear. He recounted everything, finding the bag, his deep-seated distrust of the NOPD, and the crucial memory of Russo's periodic visits to the old scrapyard. He then provided the name of the man who had facilitated the car's final journey, a low-level former officer named Marcus Thorne, who had personally overseen the vehicle's disposal years ago, paying the old foreman a hefty cash sum to ensure the Crown Victoria was tucked away in a section of the yard where it would be the last to be processed. Armed with this critical lead, the FBI located Marcus Thorne, living a quiet life in a suburb of Baton Rouge. Arrested in a pre-dawn raid, Thorne found himself in a sterile interrogation room, facing a mountain of evidence that made denial impossible. The federal prosecutor laid it all out: James's testimony, the ledger, the photographs, and the threat of a life sentence for conspiracy and murder. Thorne's loyalty to Russo, a bond forged in corruption, shattered under the weight of his own self-preservation. After a grueling 16-hour session, he broke. He confessed to being the cleanup man for Russo's crew, a peripheral member whose job was to erase their crimes. In exchange for a plea deal that would spare him the death penalty, he gave the investigators the one piece of information they so desperately needed: the location where Anja and Oscar were buried. Thorne led a somber procession of FBI agents and forensic specialists deep into the Louisiana bayou to a remote stretch of swampland in the Jean Lafitte National Historical Park and Preserve. The air was thick with the smell of decay and the drone of insects. He pointed to a small, unremarkable clearing, marked only by a gnarled cypress tree. For hours, the forensic team meticulously excavated the damp, heavy earth under the oppressive humidity. Then, one of the agents stopped digging. A hush fell over the team as they carefully brushed away the last layers of soil. There, buried together in a shallow, unmarked grave, were the skeletal remains of 2 people. A small silver ring with a Swedish inscription on one, a delicate leather bracelet on the other, confirmed what everyone already knew. After 628 days of agonizing silence, Anja Weber and Oscar Lindgren had finally been found. With the recovery of the bodies, Thorne's confession painted the full, horrifying picture of that night. He recounted how Russo and another officer, Officer Miller, had lured the couple into their unmarked car with the promise of seeing the real New Orleans. They drove them to a derelict warehouse near the Industrial Canal, where they proceeded to rob them. According to Thorne, Anya, in a moment of desperate bravery, tried to discreetly photograph their attackers with her digital camera. When Russo saw the flash, he flew into a violent rage. The robbery instantly escalated to murder. To ensure there were no witnesses, Russo and Miller executed them both on the spot. They then wrapped the bodies in industrial plastic, loaded them into the trunk, and drove them out to the bayou under the cover of darkness. The approaching hurricane, Thorne explained, was seen by Russo as a gift, a divine act of nature that would wash away all evidence of their human evil. The end came swiftly, with Thorne's testimony providing a detailed roadmap of the conspiracy and the recovered remains offering irrefutable forensic proof. The FBI executed a series of coordinated raids. Frank Russo was arrested without incident on the 9th hole of a golf course at his retirement community in Florida, his face a mask of stunned indignation as federal agents swarmed him. The other 3 members of his crew, including Officer Miller, were apprehended in separate raids in Texas and Mississippi, where they had fled after Katrina, believing they had successfully outrun their past. The images of these former police officers being led away in handcuffs were broadcast across the globe. The conspiracy of silence, which had held for 7 long years, protected by a storm and a corrupt system, was finally and irrevocably broken. Justice for Anya and Oscar, once a hopeless dream for their families, was now finally within reach. The trial of Frank Russo and his co-conspirators was more than a legal proceeding. It was a public autopsy of a city's broken soul. Held in a federal courthouse under intense media scrutiny, the prosecution laid bare the crew's entire predatory operation. Marcus Thorne, now the government's star witness, gave a chilling step-by-step account of the murders, his voice barely a whisper as he described Russo's explosive rage, the ledger, the shattered camera, and the haunting final photographs of Anya and Oscar were presented as irrefutable proof. Throughout the proceedings, Frank Russo remained a portrait of unrepentant arrogance, smirking at the jury and staring down the victims, families with cold indifference. He believed himself a product of a system that had always protected him, seemingly unable to grasp that the system itself was now on trial, and he was its most damning exhibit. After a 6-week trial, the jury returned its verdict in less than 4 hours. Frank Russo and Officer Miller were found guilty on all counts, including racketeering, conspiracy, and 2 counts of first-degree murder. The judge, calling their actions, quote, a profound betrayal of the public trust, sentenced both men to 2 consecutive life sentences without the possibility of parole. The other members of the crew received sentences ranging from 20 to 40 years. As the verdicts were read, no one in the courtroom cheered. There was only a heavy collective exhalation. Klaus Weber and Lena Lindgren sat perfectly still, tears streaming silently down their faces. It wasn't a moment of victory. It was the final, brutal confirmation of their loss. Justice had been served, but it could never restore what had been so violently taken from them. In the aftermath, the families finally began the journey of bringing their children home. The remains of Anya and Oscar were repatriated to Europe, where 2 small private funerals were held. In a quiet cemetery overlooking a Swiss lake, Anya was laid to rest. Weeks later, in a snowy churchyard in rural Sweden, Oscar was buried beside his grandparents. For 7 years, their parents had been trapped in a hell of ambiguous loss, unable to fully grieve. The trial's conclusion brought a painful finality. The sliver of impossible hope that had tormented them for so long was finally extinguished, replaced by the raw, unvarnished reality of their grief. They could finally mourn, but the closure they received was a cold comfort, a scar that would forever mark the landscape of their lives. The Russo case sent shockwaves through the New Orleans Police Department, triggering a reckoning that had been decades in the making. The FBI's investigation uncovered a pervasive culture of corruption and brutality that went far beyond Rousseau's crew. The scandal became the tipping point for a full-scale federal intervention. The U.S. Department of Justice launched a sweeping civil rights investigation into the NOPD, culminating in a legally binding consent decree in 2013. This decree forced a complete overhaul of the department, mandating new policies on use of force, community policing, recruitment, and internal discipline. The murder of 2 European tourists had inadvertently become the catalyst for reforming one of America's most troubled police forces, a painful but necessary purge born from an unimaginable tragedy. Refusing to let their children's deaths be a mere footnote in a story of corruption, the Weber and Lindgren families channeled their grief into a lasting legacy. They pooled their remaining resources and established the Lindgren-Weber Foundation for Safe Travels. The nonprofit organization had a dual mission: to educate young people about the potential dangers of international travel in high-risk areas, and to provide financial and legal support to families whose loved ones go missing abroad. Their personal tragedy was transformed into a powerful tool for advocacy and protection. Anya and Oscar, who had set out to document their blueprint for adventure, now had their names attached to a blueprint for safety, ensuring their story would serve as a warning and a lifeline for future generations of travelers. Today, if you visit the Swedish honorary consulate in New Orleans, you will find a small, understated bronze plaque mounted on an interior wall. It bears the names Anya Weber and Oscar Lindgren, with the simple inscription, "Lost to the city they came to embrace, forever remembered." It is a quiet, solemn tribute, a world away from the neon chaos of Bourbon Street, where their journey ended. Their story remains a dark chapter in the city's history, a testament to how innocence can be consumed by a cynical world. But it is also a powerful reminder that truth, no matter how deeply buried, can be unearthed by the persistence of a few good people, and that even in the face of absolute darkness, the fight for justice can and must prevail. The story of Anya Weber and Oscar Lindgren is far more than a chronicle of a crime. It is a stark and painful parable about the collision of innocence and corruption, of light and profound darkness. Their journey, which began with such boundless optimism, ended in a shallow grave in the Louisiana bayou, a casualty of a predatory system hiding behind a badge. Yet their tragedy was not entirely in vain. The accidental discovery of their passports in a forgotten police car did more than solve their disappearance. It forced the city to confront a sickness it had long ignored. Their deaths became the unwilling catalyst for a reckoning, proving that sometimes the smallest whisper of truth can be loud enough to bring down a fortress of lies, even one protected by the chaos of a hurricane. For the Weber and Lindgren families, the end of the trial was not an end to their pain, but the beginning of a new purpose. Consumed by a grief that no verdict could ever truly soothe, they chose to build a legacy of protection from the ruins of their loss. The Lindgren-Weber Foundation for Safe Travels became their life's work, a testament to their unwavering love. The foundation doesn't just share cautionary tales. It creates practical safety guides for young travelers, establishes global support networks for families of the missing, and lobbies governments for more robust consular assistance. In this way, Anya and Oscar's blueprint for adventure was reborn. Their names, once symbols of a tragedy, now represent a beacon of hope and a shield for the next generation of explorers venturing into an unpredictable world. New Orleans, a city defined by its resilience, had to absorb another deep wound. The revelation of Frank Rousseau's murder ring was a profound betrayal that eroded the fragile trust between the community and its police force at a time when the city was already on its knees. The federal consent decree was not a magic cure. It was the first painful step on a long road toward accountability. The story of the 2 European students is now woven into the city's complex, haunted folklore. It serves as a permanent, chilling reminder of the human cost of unchecked power and institutional silence. Their ghosts walk alongside the city's celebrated history, a quiet but potent warning that the soul of a place is only as strong as the justice it provides for its most vulnerable visitors. Far from the humid bayou where their lives ended, Anya and Oscar finally found peace. In quiet, sun-dappled cemeteries in Switzerland and Sweden. Their families can now visit them, replacing the torment of the unknown with the solemn ritual of remembrance. The lives they planned, filled with architectural designs and shared dreams, were stolen from them, but their story created a different, more enduring blueprint. One for truth, for perseverance, and for a love that crossed oceans and defied years of silence to bring them home. That small bronze plaque in the New Orleans consulate is more than a memorial. It is a quiet, defiant anchor in the city that took everything. A permanent declaration that even when the world tried to erase them, they would not, and will not, be forgotten. Some stories must be told, not for the darkness they contain, but for the light they ultimately reveal. The case of Anya and Oscar reminds us that justice is rarely simple and never guaranteed. It often depends on a chance discovery, an act of courage from an ordinary person, and the relentless refusal to accept a convenient lie. It shows us that even when institutions fail, the human drive for truth can eventually triumph. If you believe that no victim should be forgotten, and that the search for truth is essential, please share this video. Don't forget to subscribe for more in-depth investigations into cases that need to be told. Thank you for listening.